Okay, today we're going to be talking about research questions. And so we obviously have kind of led into this conversation by looking at the idea of choosing a program from the perspective of looking at program evaluation. And so obviously the focus of the research overall is looking at trying to assess if the program is leading to the outcomes they claim to achieve, right? Or that at least that they want to achieve, not necessarily that they know that they do. And so as we get early on in the phases, right, we want to understand, orient ourselves with the program and become familiar. So we look at things like implementation evaluation, we do logic modeling so that we can understand really how the program is executed. And then once we have that kind of foundation, we have to turn ourselves to the topic of designing the outcome evaluation. And this is really probably the first set of material where we're going to focus our direction on. We've done the logic model, we've done the lit review, we've done the implementation evaluation. We really know how the program works, right, and what's been researched before. Now we have to focus on designing our own evaluation study and how do we come up with the research design for that. One of the first things is the research question. Right, we've covered these other items, but as we get into research questions, we're really looking at this first step in the planning phase. And I will say that sometimes, right, there's a couple of different ways that this might work, right? In the first phase, right, we really want to think about using the program information that we have, the implementation evaluation, the logic model, the literature, to help guide our focus and be able to come up with a research question. I will say that sometimes, and this is where it gets a little tricky, is writing a well-crafted research question sometimes it can be like the abstract on a paper where you actually hammer out all the details of everything else in the beginning, and then you really formalize the actual one-sentence research question or statement really at the end once you've decided everything. But nonetheless, right, you really need to have at least an idea of your research question before you can get started, right? So what we're looking at here is this idea of what do you want to know, right? The first question is rarely the final one, right? And this idea here of this, right, funneling process, right? Um, if you think about a funnel in general, right, you have this idea where, right, everything gets narrower from the beginning. And so what you end up having is, right, you want to get to your research question here at the bottom. Everybody see that okay? All right, so at the upper levels, right, we want to get narrower and narrower as we work our way down, right? So right, let's say we have a program that's designed, let's say, let's not use the program example, but let's say we're looking at just research in general, right? And I care about, right, we'll say cannabis usage. Right, so, it's become legal in the state of California. We're definitely interested in it. There's a lot of policy reasons why we should be concerned, right? And so we start with the idea that, well, we know, right, we're interested in something that has to do with cannabis broadly. From there, however, there's a lot of different things that we can look at, right? Well, we're in California, right? So we're actually talking about, right, legal use case because, we're no longer dealing with kind of the illegal market. We do care about people who are using legally speaking, right? However, we're still interested in legal use for, right, medical purposes. So, even though it's legal for recreational purposes, some people now can legally acquire it and they'd be doing so for particular reasons of interest to themselves with regard to either pain management, post-traumatic stress, or any of these different reasons, right? And so now we're interested in not just legal and medical use, right? But let's say medical use, right, for we'll say sleep disorders, right? Because, right, one of the options that people may use it for is potentially people who have trouble sleeping or falling asleep or staying asleep, right? Or they have a lot of issues when they're asleep. And so now, right, we're narrowing it down to that. And actually what we're talking about is, we're actually looking at, let's say, seniors with sleep disorders, right? Because right? There's no scholarship that we found so far in the literature that actually examines anybody over the age of 65 and whether, right, of all maybe different medications they've tried so far, that whether any of them are willing to use this, right? So the idea is, right, if you look, right, we started up here with this really broad topic, and as we thought more and more about it, we worked our way down, right, and to funnel ourselves narrower and narrower to this research question, right? And there's a lot of things where we're talking about, right? There's other characteristics, right, that we don't include, which is, right, our population. We're talking about seniors, right? We might talk about time period. So only since maybe it's become legal, right? We might be talking about location. So we might be focused in on a particular geographic area of operation. So those could be different things, right? We might have, right, context or applications. We're talking about only medical use, right? Only for sleep disorders, right? So we've got some contextual questions, right? So in any type of research question design development process, right, you really have to work your way through this funnel to get down to the specific research question, right? Because if you think about, right, this just idea of cannabis broadly, right, or marijuana usage, right? Well, there's so many things, right? So if we're saying, well, the research question is going to define our research design, right? Therefore, we have to deal with measurement, right? And so if we're dealing with just this, right, as we make these decisions about, well, what do we measure? Use, illegal use, regular use, recreational use, right? Use by who, right? Do we ask seniors, children, middle-aged individuals, right? Males or females only, people of, Caucasian descent versus a different race, right? Do we ask people who used it both before and after it was legal? Do we ask people who only have started since it became legal? All of those questions, right? They become a lot of things that we have to kind of whittle down so that we can, right, work this funnel system and get to the point that we have, right, a clear and defined research question. Even if we don't have necessarily our research question perfectly spelled out in the first place, right, we do want to think about, right, the answers to some of these questions, because they're going to be critical for us being able to really rule certain things out, right? We're not going to collect data on this, and we're not going to collect data on that, right? Because we know we're at least dealing with this, right, kind of sub question here that is missing from the literature based off the review I've done. So that makes sense. Right, so that's this kind of funneling process here, right? This idea of starting with something general, some issue, some concern. In evaluation research, we tend to be looking at the idea that, well, our general concern is, does this program have an impact on something, right? So our typical baseline model is, right, we've got a program, right? We've got an outcome, and there should be an increase or decrease in something, right? So our typical research question is something like, in evaluation research, does this, right, lead to this, right? We start with that. But we have to narrow our focus, because as a lot of you have probably seen, right, you've picked programs that claim to do, everything under the sun, or they have, a million different broad positive impacts on society, right? Or sometimes it's just that they're, right, well, we claim to help people and make them happier, make them more independent, and help them, right, be self-sufficient, and all of these things, right? And that gets very muddled when you're trying to fit everything into this perfect outcome box where you have to say, I like to think of the idea of, if you take a giant sheet of cookie dough, right? You make a bunch of cookie dough and you flatten it all out, right? You have this program that's just this giant swath of dough, right? And a lot of it is all fundamental and critical to the program, right? But if you think about, right, here's our big thing of dough, right? Each research question is a cookie cutter, and I have to be able to slice, right, each of these little parts out, because, every time I need to make one, right, this is maybe self-sufficiency, right? And this is happiness, right? And this is economic outcomes, right? And so they do a lot of these things, right? But you can't treat them all as one giant entity, right? If you're going to collect data, you have to collect data on this separately from this, separately from this, right? And treat each of these little pieces as, right, their own, right, sort of evaluation element. So, right, the reason we teach you to do logic modeling and literature review and all those things first is so we can have this idea of, right, you can go to, in order to help you refine your research question, you can look at program documents, talk to program officials, right, work with the beneficiaries or recipients of services, other experts or prior literature. Any of these items here, right, in the square are things that you can use to give yourself some context and at least start the search process so you have a way to orient yourself and familiarize yourself. And if you've done a lit review and you've done the logic model, right, and you've started with the stuff that we've covered in class so far, you'll get to the point that you at least have a pretty good baseline working understanding of the program sort of broadly, even if you're coming in as a consultant or an outsider. That makes sense? Any questions about that so far? Anybody having any technical issues? Audio coming through just fine. You can see all the markups on the screen. If so, just give me a yes in the chat box so I'm aware. Okay. So the idea of funneling, right? You're working with something broad, right? You want to narrow down to something specific, right? These are some examples, right? I'm a military veteran. I'm interested in veteran care, right? But there's a lot of different ways to look at veteran care. And so this might be an example of a funneled research question that's the more specific, which is, are veterans injured in the Iraq War since 2003 receiving necessary services and support? Right? Some of these I would say are a good start, but still in and of themselves need work, right? So this idea of necessary services, I would argue that that's still a little bit generic, right? We need to define that more specifically, right? Are we talking about medical treatment? Are we talking about mental health treatment? Are we talking in, mental health itself can include a number of different subcategories. Any of those things, right, need to be more specific, right? Even here, right, we might say, well, veterans, is this, could this only be women veterans? Could this only be men veterans, right? Could this be, right, we know that we're talking about Iraq, right, but is this only maybe Marines, right? What if somebody was in the Iraq War, right? They were technically deployed to Iraq, but they were flying an Air Force jet somewhere over, the Pacific Ocean or something like that as a result of a deployment. Right? So being able to specify these things, right, since 2003, does that mean they had to be hurt after 2003, or that they had to join the service post 2003, or they had to leave the service point, after 2003? Does veterans necessarily mean, right, separated, meaning they are no longer in the military at all, right, or can they still be on active duty? So it's a good start, right, because we've narrowed our focus, but then it also gives us the ability to hone in more specifically on, okay, well, now that we've got some idea, right, let's funnel even further down in specificity. Marijuana legalization, how likely are California voters to vote on a referendum legalizing recreational marijuana? Obviously, at least 50% because we approved it, right? But right, we know we're talking about California voters. We're talking about recreational marijuana. Right? We're talking about, right, a legalization referendum, right? Not whether you support the use of it broadly, but would you actually be willing to vote for a law that passes it? Right? Federal gridlock, right? Congress doesn't do anything ever. Right? Does divided government. This is a good example from a journal article I've read before. A divided government, right? This is defined as the president, right, and Congress, right, not all being the same party, right? And this could be House or Senate, right? Result in more investigatory activity than unifying government, right? So it's not about productivity, it's about the idea of, right, does Congress investigate the president more when they're a different party, at least one half a different party than when they're together, with regard to investigating the president, which if you're watching the news today, becomes a pretty relevant question as of right now, right? So these are the type of things that we can hone in on, because now we can focus on, well, how do we measure investigatory activity, right? How do we define that? Because there should be a clear way for us to do it, and that'll help us define our research design. Pay inequality, do tenure track or tenured females, right? So we know we're talking about females, right? We're not talking about part-time lecturer staff, right? We're talking about only Cal State Long Beach, we're talking about social sciences, so we may have to define this as, right, political science, maybe sociology, public policy and administration, econ, right? We can have a specific list of which programs we mean and which ones we don't mean. Do they make less on average than their male counterparts, right? So make less, right? We're talking about monetary, right? We may want to actually define this as, right, annual salary, because you know, they might have a consulting job on the side or something like that where they bring in money. We don't want to include that. We actually specifically only want to talk about Long Beach State salaries that they receive. So all of that will help us, again, narrow this process down. So to help you with this, the process, you want to think, right, what is already known about the issue, right? This is where we're talking about literature review. This is probably a bit less relevant when we're talking about program evaluation. If you think about academic research, right, the idea is to create, right, new, right, knowledge. What that means is, right, and by a very generous academic definition, new means not already published in academic literature as something that's been found to be true, right? So for academics, this becomes really important, because when I'm writing a journal article and starting to choose a research question, right, I need to know what's already been found out, because if it's already been found, right, it's not new, and therefore I probably don't want to do the exact same thing somebody's already done. Right? We do care about how others have conducted the research in the past, right? Part because of the findings. We care about, right, what they've discovered. Part because of the methodology, because we want to know how they discovered it, right? So we care about both, right, the conclusions, the methodology, as well as not always necessarily related to the findings, right, but the arguments that people make, right? Do they find that voters are oblivious to political facts, right? Or do they find that even though they are oblivious to them, they're arguing that we shouldn't think of them as potentially as uninformed as maybe we want to, right? This is very important when we start getting into the practical implications for research, which are the resource requirements, right? The availability of data, the relative ease of answering possible questions. I would say this, more than anything, is something I spend a lot of my day having to deal with, because there are things like, right, my director has a meeting next Tuesday and wants some information, right? Well, what is available for me to get by next Tuesday is very different than if she's telling me next summer, right, she's going to host this event and wants to have some data to present to the public, right, wants me to put something together, right? I can do a lot more with 9 months than I can do with 7 days, right? So we're going to have different calculations, right? Data availability, right? I might have really useful data that we collected last year that I can put together, right, and therefore don't have as many resources that I need because the data is available. If it's not available, right, I'm going to have to say, I understand that a good example of this, she wanted to present data to different community events on, the health outcomes in particular regional areas. Well, a lot of the data that we work with, it comes from the Census Bureau, right? And the Census Bureau collects a lot of data, but there are certain areas that they don't collect, right? They don't distinguish by certain low levels of information. Or the state, the state only collects the data and the state only aggregates at the state level. And so what happens is, right, well, if you ask, for, let's say, census, right, I might be able to give you the neighborhood, right? And so let's say like diabetes, for example, is collected by the census and therefore I have it, right? But the California Department of Public Health, right, only does AIDS information, right? And they don't collect data at a local level, they aggregate up to the county. So if she wants to go into a particular neighborhood and say, talk to Fontana residents, right, data is available for certain things, right, and not others because of what data has been collected. And especially when you balance that with resource requirements, right, I can't give you that data, it's not available. And if it's only me who has the, right, 7-day deadline to turn it around for you because all my staff is working on other projects, right, as much as I might be able to get a lot done in 10 days, if I had unlimited resources, a blank credit card, a blank check or a credit card to pay for whatever I needed, and all 20 of my staff free, right, to do the work, that's not the situation, and therefore, right, we're in a different context than we might otherwise be. what is not being considered that might be important. This is the idea of looking at what's known about the issue and then looking for gaps in what is missing, right, or what has been overlooked. And then this is also important, which is, again, an unfortunate but practical reality consideration, which is, do certain stakeholders involved have specific concerns of interest? Meaning, right, I deal a lot with programs in our department that are grant funded. Grants have very specific things you can and cannot do with grant money. And therefore, right, let's say we have an oral health program that is funded specifically by state tobacco tax money. And so they care about both smoking cessation, oral health in general, right, and things like mouth cancer, chewing tobacco related activities, and those type of things, right? So therefore, right, they may have a whole lot of grant money to use, right, and I may be funded through some of that to do a survey, right? The sheer fact of the matter is, right, how many times people choose to brush their teeth a week is not as exciting of a question to my director who wants me to do a survey and collect information from the public on, let's say, nutrition and dietary habits and other things. However, right, the person doing the funding has these specific concerns of interest, and therefore, at a minimum, I'm going to be required to get some data collected that is pertinent to what they want, right? Because if you've ever worked with grants, right, to justify, you have to say, like, well, we're doing a survey of community members about oral health and other health-related information. And therefore, even though we don't really care as much about it, right, I have stakeholders with specific concerns. I may have a assistant director who really has a strong interest, or our health officer, for example. He used to be a gynecologist, and so he's got a very strong interest in infant health and other things. And if his unit is paying our team to put together a survey of some kind, it's very likely I'm not going to be able to get away with deploying that survey unless I add some questions specifically about infant health, pregnancy health, or some of those type of things, because those are the specific concerns of that stakeholder. So a lot of times, right, there are practical realities when you do the type of work, especially not, academics tend to have a little more freedom, but even then, right, if you're grant funded because you got money to pay for you to do research, you typically have certain requirements to fulfill the grant about what they pay for certain work because they want to do, there's a Robert Woods Foundation grant that we're looking at applying for right now for research where, right, it's designed to pay for research, but specifically they care about health and diet related research and evaluation of interventions that are designed to affect outcomes in that space, right? So we can't just use that money for anything, right? We are funded in a way where we have stakeholders that want to pay for specific types of research, and therefore we have to fulfill that obligation. Learning from others, obviously this is important. Again, right, goes back to literature review, look at what has been done on the research topic, learn what has already been known, right? This is the, right, do your lit review thoroughly, right, and see what you can find out, right? Looking at the work of others will help you with a number of things, right? It helps you narrow your research question. You know how others have chosen to narrow their research questions. You can see what questions have not been answered. You can, focus in on, maybe the last time a study like this was done was 2009, right? And so therefore, even though it's been done before, right, there's 10 more years of data that, right, needs to be reanalyzed because it's been a decade since we last looked, right? This right here, right, methods. This is a methods class, right? You need to figure out how you're going to measure things, right? How you're going to collect data, what approach to take to analyze data, right? This is where you can gain that information from doing the literature review and figuring out how people design their own research, right? Think about likely results. 20 out of 20 articles that you found say that every time we implement this type of recidivism program, it has no positive impact on inmates and participants. It should give you an idea that you should expect probably something similar, or at least don't be surprised if that's the finding that you end up discovering as well, right? This is also useful, right? Being able to identify experts who know the topic very well. Particularly this is going to be looking at if you can find researchers or academics, right? One thing about academics is they tend to be paid to be experts on a certain topic, and they tend to be very interested in giving their advice on things that they are experts in. So if you find a couple of scholars who have a bunch of articles evaluating a similar program to one that you're interested in or you've been assigned to work on, reach out to them and see if they're willing to provide you some guidance or discuss or answer questions that you have, because that is one of the things they tend to do and are a good resource for that. Any questions on any of that up to this point? Okay, so when we're talking about research questions, obviously there's different types of research that we can do. We have obviously these three here: descriptive, normative, or cause and effect questions. Okay, descriptive questions are this idea of what is, right? We're doing a presentation on Thursday about this idea of obesity, right, in San Bernardino County, and we're putting together a bunch of maps and analyses, right? We do the idea of a descriptive question of what is, right? What are obesity rates, right? All we want to know, at least initially, is, right, where is obesity better or worse, right? And not better or worse necessarily, but higher or lower, right? And when, because we want to look at the last 10 years or so to figure out if, right, it was higher or lower than it was before, right? We're not making any claims other than, well, what is the current state? And this tends to be a really good, this idea of descriptive analysis. It's a very good starting point, because when you're familiarizing yourself with data or a topic, right, the best thing you can start to do is this general analysis of what is the where, the when, right, the context questions. Right? I need to know, do we have data on obesity? Where do we see obesity more or less? Those type of things, right? Normative questions is when we start to get into this philosophical of what should be, right? Right? Should, right, obesity be higher, right, in a particular region than we would think, or should it be lower, right, or should it be worse in a particular area or population, right? So when we're starting to look at, we have a particular, let's say Hesperia in the high desert, we're looking at Victorville, right? We see what is the obesity rates up there, right? Then we can ask the question of, well, should it be lower than that, right? Usually this means that you have to make a comparison of some kind, right? Anytime you're really looking at should, you're making a judgment of, you're comparing, right, kind of the current rate, right, versus some standard, right? The standard might be, well, the state of California says obesity rate in any given neighborhood should be no higher than X%, right? Maybe that's the standard that we're working with, right? And we say that it should be no more than, let's say 8.5%. Our current rate is 9.2%. I'm just making these up, right? And what we're saying is this, right, should be lower as per their standard, right? However, right, maybe the rest of the county is 10.9%, and the area we're talking about is 9.2, right? Well, should it be lower then? Well, it's actually doing better, right? It's not as good as what the state standard should necessarily be, right? But maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe that's already really good. So we wouldn't want to say, well, it should be lower there, right? Because it's actually better than the rest of the county. Obviously, with the health condition, we typically want to know obesity if we can help it, right? So we could always say, well, it should be lower, right? But there is some level that is reasonable and unreasonable with regard to, like, it can never go away indefinitely forever, right? So what is a good number, right? So we're comparing to something, right? And then these cause and effect questions, right? This is where we're getting into the why, right? We have a nutrition program, right? It runs this, exercise and healthy eating initiative, right? It's meant to have a reduction in obesity, right? And what we want to do is research whether or not, right, obesity is going up or down as a result of this program, right? That is a cause and effect question, right? Does, right, this program cause this effect, which is this reduction of obesity? right? We're not describing the rates anymore. We're not saying it should be better, it should be worse. We want to know if the program itself, through our evaluation, says this program causes, right, the impact we see. And maybe it's not obesity, right? Maybe it's just it's a change in healthy eating decisions, right? Maybe it is an increase in healthy eating. Maybe it's an increase in exercise. It could be just a general increase in knowledge about um, calories, caloric intake, and monitoring your diet. But any of those things could be different outcomes we care about, right? But we want to be able to say that this program caused that change that we're seeing, right? And that's something very different than the other two things. So, right, obviously, description. We're painting a picture of a certain condition. In this case, right, we use the obesity example. A snapshot of what is. Right, again, we're talking about where, when, what year, right, location. We're not talking about why. A lot of times we're talking about who. So, is it different for men versus women? Is it different for, young versus old? All of these type of, right, journalistic questions where we're describing what's going on, not making any argumentative inference. Right. So, how many people receive food stamps in the year 2013? How much did they receive on average? What was the total expenditure by the government? So, right, SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, right, provides these services. Right, we're not making a judgment about it. We just want to know, right, before we make an argument, right, the general facts. And I think this day and age, we need to appreciate this a bit more, right? Because the idea of figuring out what the facts are first, because before you can make a judgment about what should or should not be, right, you need to be informed about what is. Politically speaking, for better or for worse, a lot of people jump to the what should be and the why without ever describing the what is, and they tend to be wrong, and that is part of the problem. Right. This idea of normative questions, right? What should we be doing? Are we hitting, right, a target? Right. This is some, right, standard again that we're comparing to, right? Thinking about the archer here, right? And this is what we want to target. Are we hitting it? Right. So we're taking what is and we're comparing it to what should be. Right. So again, we might be looking at SNAP payments, right? Figure out what they are, right? And then saying, right, are these too high or are they too low, right? Based on what we know people get, right? And then we have to compare and say, right, is it, right, greater than last year, right? Maybe that's our comparison, right? Is it right, greater than, let's say in California, right? Is it more in California than in Nevada, possibly, right? Now, are we paying more than any other state, right? Are we, paying more than, let's say, European Union countries on a per, right, capita basis, right? So per person, are we paying more for food support, right? You have to be able to establish what the standard is. And, just to say that, well, they get some amount of money and that's too much money, right? It should be less. It's a philosophical argument, and that's fine because you can believe that nobody should receive anything, or you should think they should receive less. But if you're basically not going to say that 0 is the right amount, right, that the amount they're getting is too high, right, you should be able to classify this criteria of what, where you're coming from with regard to this, what should value be, right? Where did you get the should number from, right? And then again, normative questions, right? Right. We're looking at stated goals, right? So if we're talking about should, right, we might be looking performance over time. So, right, one of the examples that we do a lot, we call trend analysis, right? So we're looking at obesity in 2017, right? We're looking at obesity in 2018, right? And when we say should, right, should 2018 be higher or lower based off of what was it last year, right? Well, that number is too high. And the reason it's too high is because last year, right, it was 9.2%, right? Now it's 9.7%, right? And that's an increase relative to this, and that's what we care about, which is, well, we want it to go down over time. Therefore, it should be less than this. What do we do to bring it down, right? Relative performance, do we have a similar program to compare to? Is there an obesity program that does a similar intervention in Orange County, and are they having, similar numbers or similar increases or not? right? Sometimes expert consensus, meaning this idea of, right, we find a doctor who can tell us that they've studied obesity immensely for the entirety of their career, right, and can tell us if this is, right, too high of a change or too, a normal change or something like that from year to year, right? They might say that, plus or minus, you say 0.3% change per year, right, is normal, right? We increase by 0.5. That's too much of a change by expert opinion, right? Something like that. Right. You can read all of what's here, but the idea is that that criterion is important, right? If you're going to assess good or bad, right, you need to be able to back up why you're saying good versus bad and what criteria you're comparing against, right? So, if I'm talking about obesity in San Bernardino last year to this year, right, no one's going to probably say that that's a bad criteria to assess. However, if I'm looking at obesity rates in the city of Colorado Springs, Colorado, which might be one of the healthiest cities in America. I don't know if that's true, but let's say hypothetically it is, and we're comparing ourselves to there and saying, well, theirs is a lot lower. We need to come down by 7 percentage points. It should be 7 percentage points lower. Right? We're making a judgment call, and that might not be such a good criteria to hold ourselves accountable to. Right? Obviously, we want as little obesity as we can, right? But we also want a realistic comparison for us to be looking at to hold ourselves against. Right. Causal questions, right? We're really talking about, does X, right, lead to some change, positive or negative, in Y, right? Again, we're talking about a program, right, and we're talking about an outcome, or sometimes not necessarily a program or an outcome, right? But this is, say, political science research. Let's say, does war, right, have a causal impact on, right, the economy getting worse, right? We're looking to say that, well, when there is war, right, the economy gets worse, right? Or, right, like if you are years in Congress, right, the longer you're in Congress, does that cause you to potentially vote or raise more campaign money or something like that? Right? Is the cause the longevity and not something else? Right? That is the relationship between, right, this and this two items. Right? So the one that we tend to care the most about when we're talking about program evaluation research, what is the impact of the program? Right? That gets back to this question: does the program lead to the change in whatever outcome we are concerned about specifically? In very generic terms, right? Does the causal effect of a single independent variable, is there an effect of an independent variable on some dependent variable that we're analyzing the relationship between? Right, some examples here. Are poor children more likely to die before age 6 than non-poor children? Right? What factors are associated with innovation in public agencies? Right? Does living near a toxic waste site increase the incidence of cancer? Right? We're saying that right, specifically, this is proximity, right, to the waste site, right? This is cancer, right? And that there's an increase or positive impact, right? And this specifically is the cause, right? We're not saying that, yes, it's descriptive analysis might look at waste sites and cancer rates and describe whether or not they are or are not, whatever the numbers are, right? Think about like a GIS map where you might have, right, you have waste site here and a waste site here, right? And you're looking at how, cancer rates, right, in each of these kind of expanding circles away, right? And then you have, high here, medium here, low here, high here, medium here, low here, right? That doesn't necessarily say that that's the cause, right? Because there could be a number of other things which are, I don't know, let's say maybe there's a hospital right here too, like City of Hope, that does cancer treatment. And so a lot of people live very close to that because they moved to the hospital, and therefore rates are higher here, not because of this facility, but because of this hospital, right? You want to be able to rule that out and say, no, right, it is the waste site that's causing, right, these differences, Because right, if you found out there was a waste site right here, right, and that cancer rates were the same everywhere, right, they were still low in these areas. Now you're not really so sure that you can say that causes the relationship that you think you're seeing, right? So being able to rule out these other factors is extremely important when we're trying to make a causal statement. So this I want to walk you through because this is the idea of, basically, if you ever did remember doing Mad Libs when you were a kid, where you had the book and there was a lot of blanks where you get to fill it in with a noun or an adjective or something like that. Right. This is an example of, right, sort of a specific and refined and funneled research question, right, that can be serving as an example for you, which is, will the CSULB nutrition education program lead to a higher level of healthy eating amongst participants after 6 months when compared to other CSULB students who do not participate, right? And there's a few things, right, that I've given you here, right, that can help you fill in the blanks, right, to identify. Right? The first is this idea of will the blank, right? So you always first are talking about the independent variable, which is, right, this program. In this case, we're talking about CSULB nutrition program, right? So we have filled that in there, right? Lead to, right? Again, here we have higher level, right? Either an increase or decrease, right? This is also our hypothesis. You should know enough about the program you've chosen to know whether or not the program should cause something to go up or down if it were working right? If a program is designed to help inmates better their lives, you don't want to think it should lead to a reduction, an increase in recidivism, meaning, well, the program makes people go back to jail more often than if they weren't in the program, right? So that may not necessarily be true when you collect the data, but nonetheless, you should have some hypothesis, what we call a directional hypothesis, meaning, right, you should have an informed guess about what the nature of the relationship will be with regard to up or down as the outcome, right? And right, healthy eating, this is our outcome that we care about, which is people eating better. So this is something you should be able to pull from your logic model, and again, fill in here to say what the outcome is that we expect to see change. After blank, right, we have here, we have a time period, because specifically any study, right, has to know when to start, when to end, and how long it should be collecting data for. So we're obviously talking about however long this program lasts plus 6 months after that point, right? Because we've set that parameter for ourselves, right? And then the last part is compared to, right, other CSULB students who do not participate, right? This last point, we call this a counterfactual, right? Then we'll talk more about this idea of a control group in later weeks, right? But the idea here is if you're going to show that a program causes an outcome to occur, right, you want to be able to also say, right, what the counterfactual is. And the counterfactual is, if these students would not have participated in this program, what would have happened to them? And so if we have other students who are not involved in the program that we also collect data on to see what happens to their eating behavior, right, we might be able to say that, right, these people in the program saw healthy eating go up, right? These people who were not in the program, right, we basically saw no general change in their eating habits. Right? This is the counterfactual, which is how we know that the program caused this change, because over here we didn't see that change. So right, this should help guide you to be able to specify, using a simple Mad Libs process, a research question that is narrowed and specific and should work well for evaluation research. Right? And so let me pull up your discussion post for next week, because that is going to be having you look at this question of writing a research question and doing this for yourself. Does everybody see beach board? So you're going to have a research question, a hypothesis question. And this is, we'll blow this up so you can see it. Hopefully everybody can see that. If not, let me know. Right, but you're going to develop 2 research questions and associate a hypothesis for your evaluation proposal. For each of these 2, you want to write a single sentence. So much like you saw on the PowerPoint slide, that should include a directional hypothesis, meaning, state whether you think it should go up or down as a result. An established time period. So if you know how long you think it should take, so, this is a health program, we expect it to take 6 months from the time the program ends to see some impact, or it might take 3 years, something like that. And a counterfactual comparison group or standard. Right. So think about, right, it might be the same participants, but before they started the program. So you could be comparing right, one point in time to a later point in time. You might be comparing people who participate in the program with people who are on a wait list and haven't started yet. You might be comparing some students in one class to students in a different class who aren't receiving the same type of information or training. Right? It could just be general members of the population compared to similar types of people who are recipients of your program or service, but identify that. So something like this example here, like you just saw, will the Long Beach Nutrition Program lead to higher levels of healthy eating amongst participants after 6 months when compared to CSU LB students who do not participate? If you're going to do 2 research questions, right, the specific thing here is, do you want to focus on, right, this is healthy eating? It should be 2 different outcomes. So most everybody's picked a program that at least claims to have multiple positive impacts, right? So for each, right, choose 2 of those different outcomes that they may target. So, let's say job retention and annual earnings, right? It's a job training program that's meant to help keep people jobs longer and get them paid more, right? Each of those is a different outcome, and therefore do 1 research question for earnings potential and a different research question hypothesis for job retention, right? So choose those 2 outcomes, do 1 research question for each, and use that Mad Libs type of approach right, that you see here, right, to be able to, right, just fill in the blanks and refine and funnel down your research question into something very specific that you can work with. That make sense to everybody? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of yeses, so hopefully you won't have any trouble with that. You should have your feedback back from me from the last post, at least from a week ago. You should have another post that's due today, if you haven't done that yet, for the lit review portion. And then if there are no other questions, I will go ahead and stick around for after lecture questions for everybody. And if not, I will see you next week.